The rosary is a later adaptation of an ancient monastic device called prayer beads, which is what I have here. This is what the Orthodox still use. So Orthodox being the Eastern Church, Roman Catholic being the Western Church after the great schisms. Some of you don't care about any of this. Some of you think it's great, right? Fascinating history. Kyrie Jesu Christe, Yitatheu elesome. That's Greek for Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. It's lifted right from the parable of the Pharisee and the publican. Later, the blind man will say, Lord Jesus Christ, Son of God, have mercy on me. And he's healed of his blindness. And so those two things are sort of conflated in church tradition, and a prayer is born. That prayer has been used for well over 1,000 years by Christians all over the world. And it's really quite a powerful prayer, because rooted in that prayer is the concept of humility. You're acknowledging Jesus as Lord, the Son of God, and then you're asking for something that only God can give, and that is mercy. Mercy in this case is not simply forgiveness of bad things you've done, but it's God's ability to heal and make you well, to make the world better. We ask for mercy because we need God to heal. We need God to heal us, and we need God to heal our neighbors and our world. All of this is really mandated, this sort of praying and desiring mercy and humbling ourselves before God, because deep down we all suffer from the sin of pride. And it's one we haven't really talked about at face value during this series. We are in a series called From Eden. We're talking about sin. And as I keep joking, I know you guys love to talk about sin, so I'm finally doing it. But it is something we need to talk about from time to time. And we need to talk about it in a helpful and healthy way that can benefit the church, not to guilt trip and not to let people off easy, but to talk about the reality of brokenness and fallenness and pain and suffering, and how God is able to heal and wants to heal. But maybe at the root of all sin, and certainly the church has taught this for a long time, literally for hundreds and hundreds of years, pride is at the root of sin, of all sin. Pride is perhaps the vice above all vices. Just in the book of Proverbs, at least 3 times that I could think of. Proverbs 11:2. When pride comes, then comes disgrace, but with humility comes wisdom. Proverbs 16:5. The Lord detests all the proud of heart. Be sure of this, they will not go unpunished. Proverbs 16:18. Pride goes before destruction, a haughty spirit before a fall. You've heard that one before, right? Pride comes before a fall. God opposes the proud, but gives grace to the humble. The humble will be exalted, but the exalted will be humbled. That's my favorite verse in the Bible. We've been speaking about David, King David. Last week we talked about David and Bathsheba. It's an interesting story, and it teaches us a lot. We talked about David before Nathan. We talked about the sin of isolation and secrecy. But I want to keep thinking about David, and this time I want to think about those around David. His sin was isolation, but those around David suffered from pride. One thing that David had that we praise him for was humility. He was a man after God's own heart, but those around him were not. Maybe the first story you'll remember is David versus who? Goliath. When you think of pride, there may be no one that comes to your mind quicker than Goliath, the great giant soldier of the Philistines, who's faced down by a little shepherd boy, son of David, a son of Jesse, David the youngest, who with a sling and a stone brings down this mighty warrior. It's a great story because it's the story of pride being brought low. Here's this man who defies the God of living armies and the God of Israel. And David says, you can't stand before God. You're going to fall. And I'm going to make you drop. And then he says, I'm going to cut your head off when I'm done with your own sword, which he does. It's kind of a gruesome story. It's almost like the bigger they are, the harder they fall, which is a lesson in pride. But that's not the only time we see that in David's life. David is really opposed most of his tenure as king until his time of becoming king by the one who was already the king. Anybody remember who that is? Saul. Yeah, King Saul. Saul is the first official king over the monarchy of Israel, and he was chosen by the people because he seemed like a good king. He was actually quite terrible. And so God elects David to be the new king, but Saul is still the king. And David, in humility, honors that and tries to respect Saul, but Saul, in jealousy and pride, comes after David time and time again. You may remember the famous story where Saul is defecating in a cave, and David's hiding in that cave, comes up, cuts the corner of his robe, waits for him to leave, then comes out and says, "Hey, look, I could have taken your life, and you would have never known I was there, but I spared you because I respect you." And Saul doesn't say, "Oh, wow, David, you are a good man. You should be the king." He just becomes more proud and angrier. And the story continues. That struggle ends with King Saul being humiliated in his death with his son, or sons, plural. Then we also have David later, once he's the king and he has adult children of his own, opposed by his own son, Absalom. In 2 Samuel 15, Absalom wants to be the king. He's so proud, he thinks, "I'll be a better king than my father David." David, of course, being the greatest king Israel ever knew. And Absalom opposes his father in battle, and Absalom ends up dying, and David cries out the famous phrase, "Absalom, oh Absalom." And it's haunting because he was wounded in more than one way. He not only lost a son, but he was betrayed by that son, and they didn't get to reconcile before his death. So really a horrible story. And it's not the only time, because then later Adonijah, another son of David, in pride, opposes his father and tries to take the kingship away, forms a coup against his own dad. Pride is all over the Bible. I mean, we see it from the beginning to the end. And pride is all over our lives. We see it every day. But there is a passage, perhaps one of the strongest wording, perhaps some of the strongest wording in the Bible, is in the prophet Isaiah, chapter 14. That's what I want to look at for a moment. This isn't directed at David or Israel or really any of the biblical characters that we love. Instead, it's directed at the enemies of God's chosen people, the Babylonians and the Assyrians. If you know your Israelite history, or even your ancient Near Eastern world history, there were empires that would rise and fall throughout the ancient world. And in succession, you had Babylon that took Israel captive. You have Assyria that took the northern kingdom of Israel captive, and then later you have Babylon that took Judah captive and overwhelmed Assyria. You remember Babylon because of King Nebuchadnezzar. That was Babylon, okay? In these stories, in these annals of history, we sometimes gloss over the fact that there were kings and rulers who made these decisions to wipe out entire people groups or disperse them around the ancient world, take them out of their homelands. There's bad stuff that was happening, historically speaking. Bad stuff happening to real people. And they often turned these individuals into slave labor, took their women and had their way with them, abused their children and turned them into slaves. It was rough. It was not a good time in human history when these sort of coups and takeovers would happen at a dynastic level, at a kingdom level. So when you survey history, you see that as Babylon or Assyria rising to power. But if you were there, it was a corrupt ruler taking people, ripping them out of their homes, taking their children away from them and turning them into slaves, taking their wives from them and doing whatever they wanted, as you can imagine. It was bad. And it was to this situation that God spoke through the prophet Isaiah, to these pagan rulers, these corrupt human powers filled with pride. So I want to look at Isaiah 14. Again, this is pretty strong language. Verse 3, "When the Lord has given you rest from your pain and turmoil and the hard service with which you were made to serve," now he's speaking to Israel, "you will take up this taunt against the king of Babylon. How the oppressor has ceased, the insolent fury ceased. The Lord has broken the staff of the wicked, the scepter of rulers that struck the peoples in wrath with unceasing blows, that ruled the nations in anger with unrelenting persecution. Now the whole earth is at rest and quiet. They break forth into singing. The cypress rejoices at you, the cedars of Lebanon, saying, 'Since you were laid low, no woodcutter comes up against us.' Sheol beneath is stirred up to meet you when you come." Sheol is the pit of the dead. So he's saying you're about to die. It's about to get ugly. "It rouses the shades to greet you, all who were leaders of the earth. It raises from their thrones all who were kings of the nations. All of them will answer and say to you, 'You too have become as weak as we. You have become like us. Your pomp is brought down to Sheol. The sound of your harps, maggots are laid as a bed beneath you, and worms are your covers. How you are fallen from heaven, O day star, son of dawn. how you are cut down to the ground, you who laid the nations low. You said in your heart, I'll ascend to heaven, above the stars of God. I'll set my throne on high. I'll sit on the mount of assembly in the far reaches of the north. I'll ascend above the heights of the clouds. I'll make myself like the Most High. But you are brought down to Sheol, to the far reaches of the pit. Those who see you will stare at you and ponder over you. Is this the man who made the earth tremble, who shook kingdoms, who made the world like a desert and overthrew its cities, didn't let his prisoners go home? All the kings of the nations lie in glory, each in his own tomb. But you are cast out, away from your grave like a loathed branch, clothed with the slain, those pierced by the sword who go down to the stones of the pit, like a dead body trampled underfoot. You will not be joined with them in burial, because you've destroyed your land. You've slain your own people. May the offspring of evildoers never more be named. Prepare slaughter for his sons because of the guilt of their fathers, lest they rise and possess the earth and fill the face of the world with cities. I will rise up against them, declares the Lord of hosts. I will cut off from Babylon their name and remnant, descendants and posterity, declares the Lord. And I will make it a possession of the hedgehog, pools of water, and I'll sweep it with the broom of destruction, declares the Lord of hosts. That's heavy stuff. That's a prophecy, sometimes attributed to the devil, although I don't know why contextually that happens, other than the morning star, dawn, all of that. But that's really an allusion to King Nebuchadnezzar and other Babylonian and pagan kings calling themselves God. Actual God says to these humans who wish they were God that they are proud and they will be brought low, and that the higher they rose, the further down into the pit they will fall. It's a warning. And I do think it's a warning. It's called a taunt. I think it's a warning that if you allow pride to get the best of you, you will have to be humbled. As Jesus later says, the exalted will be humbled, but the humbled will be exalted. That's the good news. So I wonder if we still see this today, the sin of pride. Do we still see earthly human powers thinking that they're God, that they have control, that they're secure in their positions of authority, that they have the right to control other people? What do you think? You still see that? Do we still see people who don't recognize that they're sick and broken, don't realize that they're imperfect, but instead assume it's everyone else's fault? Yeah? And then another question that you don't have to answer out loud. Do we ourselves ever suffer from pride? Jesus spoke about it a lot, about the sin of pride. And he did it in ways that were pretty unique and creative. I think of his parables in particular. He told the parable of the prodigal son. We talk about that one all the time. But it's easy to miss that both brothers in the parable were proud. One was so proud, the younger, that he said to his father, I'd like to send you to an early proverbial grave so I can get my inheritance and get the heck out of here and do what I want to do. Because living under your roof isn't good. I don't like it. I want to do what I want to do. And in pride, he opposed his father, took his inheritance and left and squandered it. Then, of course, he comes home humbled, because that's what happens to the proud. They fall low. He's in a pigsty wanting to eat pig food, and he comes home and he repents. But meanwhile, the older brother, who has faithfully worked hard and tried to earn his father's love and respect, is still angry and proud that his younger brother would be received openly and forgiven when he's worked really hard and never received what was due to him. Both brothers suffer from pride in different ways. And really, it's a story about pride. And it ends with an open-ended thought. Will the older brother go into the party? The father comes out and entreats him. And he says, please come into the party. All I have has always been yours. Now come in and celebrate. Your brother was dead, now he's alive. It's a question of pride. Will you let go of your pride and come in and party? Because if you are proud, you can't party with God. That sounded like a cheesy thing to say. I didn't write that down. I would have never written that down. If you're, don't put that on Twitter. If you're proud, you can't party with God. I hate being ADHD when I preach. All right. Let's move on to another story. Do you remember the one about the banquet feast and the seats of honor? Jesus says, if you go to a feast, it's a proverbial feast. If you go to a feast, don't try to get the seat of greatest honor up by the front, by the host. Because what if he comes in later and says, oh, I'm sorry, man, someone else is going to have that seat. You need to go down there. Then you'll be embarrassed. Instead, you should go in and get the lowest seat that you can find, and then it's very likely the host will come to you and say, buddy, what are you doing all the way back here? Come on up closer. And then you'll be honored in front of all the guests, which is just a common sense way of saying, don't lift yourself up higher than you ought to be, but stay humble. Because as Jesus says, the humble will be exalted. And if you exalt yourself, you're going to be humble. That's a good one. And then another one that's famous and often misunderstood is a story about heaven and hell. It actually has nothing to do with heaven or hell, and it's repeated in lots of other Jewish literature in different ways. But it's a story of Eleazar and Dives, or the non-Jew and the rich man. And so you know it as Lazarus and the rich man. But it's a parable found in many places in the ancient Near East, and it's always about pride and arrogance among the rich and the mistreatment of the poor. And Jesus tells the story to teach a lesson that in his economy, in his kingdom, it is the humble poor one who will be blessed in the bosom of Abraham. It was Eleazar in the Old Testament, a non-Jewish man who faithfully served Abraham and was richly blessed by God. It wasn't the wealthy, powerful ones who were blessed. They were the ones held accountable for misusing what they had. And so this parable says there's a gulf that cannot be crossed between this rich man, Dives, which is the Latin word for a rich man. So you have Dives on one side, the rich man, and you have this poor servant who longed for help and never received any. And now he's in the bosom of Abraham. He's in the place of great blessing. And it says there's this place between that can't be crossed. And the point of the parable is that thing between them is pride. It's pride. And we know that because the rich man, says to Abraham, won't you send Lazarus to my brothers to warn them so they don't end up here like me? The implication being, you didn't warn me, God didn't give me enough information, I'll fix it. I'll send Lazarus to fix this. He'll tell my brothers what they need to know so they don't end up here. And Abraham says, they didn't listen to Moses or the prophets. They're not going to listen if somebody comes back from the dead. The implication being, you're still too proud to understand. You are the person who can't cross because of your own pride. Again, a sort of open-ended tale to make us wonder, what will that proud rich person do? Will they eventually repent and be able to apologize to Lazarus or Eleazar, this poor one who was mistreated? These stories are important for Jesus. He tells a bunch of them because it's the world we live in. It's a world that is sick with pride, and pride leads to all sort of abuses. So I thought of another one. It's in fact one of my very favorites, and it's in Luke chapter 18, verses 9 through 14. And this is the parable from which we get the Jesus prayer. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. Luke 18, beginning in verse 9. Jesus also told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. That context seems awfully important. He told this parable to some who trusted in themselves that they were righteous and treated others with contempt. 2 men went up into the temple to pray. One, a Pharisee, the other, a tax collector. I hope those words aren't too tainted in your mind with connotation. We think of Pharisees as the bad guys in the Gospels. But at the time the Gospels were written, they were the good guys. They were people like me. They were church leaders, religious people, people that were loved in their communities, people who set an example to follow. Tax collectors were traitors. They were the bad guys. The Pharisee, standing by himself, prayed thus, God, thank you that I'm not like other men, extortioners, unjust, adulterers, or even like this tax collector. I fast twice a week. I give tithes of all that I get. But the tax collector, standing far off, would not even lift up his eyes to heaven, but he beat his breast, saying, God, be merciful to me, a sinner. I tell you, this man went down to his house justified rather than the other. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, but the one who humbles himself will be exalted. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. According to the historian Josephus in Antiquities, the Pharisees were some of the most important people in everyday Jewish life. They established and maintained practice of the Mosaic law. They protected the law. They helped interpret the law. They had scribes that worked with them, the lawyers basically, who were in charge of interpreting the law. They were respected guardians of Jewish religion. They weren't bad guys. And so we have to be careful when we hear these stories not to see them the way that we see them from the gospel perspective, as those who wanted Jesus dead. To the common population of ancient Israel, these were the heroes. They were the ones trying to bring Messiah back to save the people. This one in particular was apparently a great example. He fasted twice a day, or twice a week, I don't remember now, twice a week, and he gave a tithe of all that he received. Jesus will elsewhere say some of these Pharisees tithed their spice cabinet, their mint, their dill, their cumin, if you can imagine. Most of us today don't even practice any kind of tithe officially. These men were tithing 10% of their spices in their cabinets. Everything they had, they gave to God. They were faithful. They were good. They were not bad guys. And it would be unfair to tell the story as if they were villains, because then we'd have a reason for the Pharisee not to go home justified. But that's the problem. We have to have a reason, don't we? Tax collectors, however, were traitors. They really were bad guys. And we want to erase that. We want to say, oh, he just had a tough hand at life, and he ended up becoming a tax collector, didn't know what it was going to entail, and now he can't get out of it. He's in too deep. And, we know people like that. We just feel sorry for him. But that's not the point. Jesus doesn't give some sob story to explain why he's a tax collector. He's just a tax collector, and we're supposed to assume he's the worst kind. He's the kind that creeps into church and stands in the back because he can't even look up toward the heavens. He's so ashamed of himself. He's not a good guy. He's not, Joe the barber, the bartender, who's just like an average guy. He never goes to church, but he's really a good guy deep down, and we all love him. That's not him. He is a villain, and he's supposed to be. But again, we need him to have a reason in himself to be justified by God, because then we can make sense of the story. We can turn the parable into something easy to swallow. We have to fix it. That's the problem with the parables of Jesus. We have to fix them. They're not good on their own. They don't work, not in our brains. They become a paradox. If you don't know tax collectors in the ancient Near East, they were collecting taxes from their neighbors left and right, and they used those taxes to extort and line their own pockets, taking extra. It was believed that at the prime of ancient Rome's occupation of Judea, they were sometimes taxed 70 to 75% of their annual income. And they were already poor. Some of you hate the IRS for taking 15 or 20%, right? Imagine 75% of what you make being taken from you. And you're already living in poverty. These are the guys who take it. And they have armed guards to help them, so you can't stop them. And they live in luxury while you go hungry next door. These are not good guys. But we need to change the story. We have to fix it. We have to fix it. Because there has to be a reason within the Pharisee for him to be not justified, and within this tax collector for him to be justified. We can't believe in grace, as a free gift. There's just something about it that we can't accept. Jesus doesn't want us to do that. You can't turn the Pharisee into a religious bigot and say, he's a holy roller, he's a phony, he's lying, he doesn't actually do a bunch of good deeds and give alms to the poor. No, he does. He really does. And he really is a good guy. And we can't say the tax collector has just had a tough life and we need to cut him some slack. He's a villain, and he takes advantage of his neighbors. He's a bad guy. And when we read the story that way, then it is a paradox, and that's what Jesus wants. He wants you to read it and think, wow, it's the sin of pride. It's not the way we use the word in English a lot of times, but the biblical sense of pride. You know what I mean by biblical pride. I don't mean you're proud of your kids' accomplishments or something. I'm proud to be an American. I'm saying pride like arrogance, conceit. Pride as in as it's defined theologically, an excessive and disordered love of self. That's pride, an excessive, disordered love of the self. Pride is ego-driven living. It's selfish, self-righteous. It despises other people. That's what Jesus says. He told them this parable because some of them trusted in themselves that they were righteous and therefore despised other people. Do you know anyone like that who thinks that they're really good and they look down on others? If not, I have mirrors at my house you could borrow. At times, we're all proud, aren't we? See, you seem to not like this sermon. Is it because it's hitting a sore spot, maybe? The Pharisee in the Greek, and I found this fascinating. I've tried not to use a lot of the Hebrew and Greek with you guys because I know you don't care, but sometimes it is helpful. In this case, I think it's helpful. The Pharisee prays pros hauton, which literally means to himself. He prays to himself out loud. What is that? The tax collector says he cries out to God and beats his breast. Lord, have mercy on me, a sinner. But the Pharisee prays to himself. Who prays to themselves? When you pray to yourself, who's your God? Think about that. Who's he trying to impress? I want to read some quotes to you from one of my favorite little books. If you have never read Mere Christianity, I highly recommend it. I only have this one copy in my office, so if I loan it to you, please give it back. But I will say it's not expensive. You could probably get it on Amazon. I'll buy you a copy if you really want it. Mere Christianity is a great book. And he has a whole chapter on the great sin, C.S. Lewis, if you're not aware. And this chapter on sin is great because he talks about it as the root of all other sin and as being perhaps the most detestable. This is what he says. Pride is essentially competitive, meaning in essence, it's competitive. It's competitive by its very nature. While the other vices are competitive only, so to speak, by accident. Pride gets no pleasure out of having something, only out of having more of it than the next person. We say people are proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but they're not. They're proud of being richer or cleverer or better looking than the other person. Think about that. We say we're proud of being rich or clever or good looking, but no, you're not. You're proud of being richer, cleverer, or better looking than someone else. If everyone became equally rich, clever, good looking, etc., there'd be nothing to be proud about. It is comparison that makes you proud, the pleasure of being above the rest. Once that element of competition is gone, then pride is gone. But pride always means enmity and competition. It is enmity, not only enmity between man and man, but enmity between man and God. In God, and think about this, you come up against something which is in every respect immeasurably superior to yourself. Unless you know God as that, and therefore know yourself as nothing in comparison, you don't know God at all. As long as you're proud, you cannot know God. That's the gulf that keeps Dives, the rich man, from the bosom of Abraham. He can't know the blessings of God because he's proud. And if you're proud, you can't know God. This is what Lewis says. A proud man is always looking down on things and people. And of course, when you're looking down, you can't see what's above you. Pride is spiritual cancer. It eats up the very possibility of love or contentment or even common sense. Remember what Jesus said to those self-righteous Pharisees. He says, it's the sick who need a doctor, not the well. He wasn't telling the Pharisees that they were well. He was trying to tell them that they were sick and delusional. Pride is dangerous because it makes you think you're not sick. And if you don't think you're sick, you don't go get help. Kylie will tell you, I don't ever go to the doctor unless I'm dying. Literally, a few years ago, I had anaphylactic shock from our dog, and I put my head in the freezer and took Benadryl. And she said, go to the doctor. She called my sister, who's a nurse manager. She's crying on the phone. Go to the hospital. You're going to die. I was like, I'm fine. I turned beet red. I said, I can't breathe. You're probably right. I can't breathe. And so then I went to the ER. Of course, finally, the Benadryl kicked in. It started opening up. And then they said, you might want to keep an EpiPen with you. I was literally dying and didn't want to go to the doctor. Why? Because I can't believe that I need a doctor. There's some stupid pride in me that thinks, I'm not sick. I'm fine. I'm fine. What is that? It's ugly. It's dangerous. We either believe that we are good enough not to need God's help, so we're inhibited from God's healing power, or we believe God wouldn't want to help us because we know God better than God knows God, and even though he says he loves us, he couldn't love us. That false humility, that self-deprecation is its own kind of pride. And some of you are like, oh, I'm exempt from this because I'm actually a really humble person. When you're self-deprecating, that's pride. That's pride. You think God wouldn't want to help you. You don't deserve it. That's the twofold problem of pride. To get help, you not only have to believe you need help, you have to believe God would want to help you, which means you have to trust God when he says it. And some of you either don't think you need help because you got it, you're good, or you don't think God would help you because you're so terrible or you're so unworthy. Although God himself has said, I want to help you. Proven it to you. The opposite of the vice of pride is the virtue that we call humility. Humility is not self-deprecating. It's the healthy love of self. It's the properly ordered, not excessive love of self and others, and of course, God primarily. To undermine your inherent worth is to disagree with what God has said. That false humility, that hatred of yourself is its own form of pride. So you don't feel good enough, and you make that some kind of righteous proof of humility. In fact, that's dishonest. It stands in opposition to God. Self-worth and self-esteem are part of healthy humility. I'm going to read you one other quote from Lewis. This is how he ends the chapter on the great sin of pride. He says, don't imagine that if you ever meet an actually humble person, that he'll be what most people call humble nowadays. He will not be a sort of greasy, smarmy person who's always telling you that, of course, he's nobody. Probably all you'll think about him is that he seemed a cheerful, intelligent chap who took a real interest in what you had to say to him. If you dislike him, it's probably because you feel a little envious of anyone who seems to enjoy life so easily. He will not be thinking about humility because he won't be thinking about himself at all. If anyone would like to acquire this humility, I think, tell him the first step. The first step is to realize that one is proud, and that's a big step. At least nothing, whatever, can be done before it. If you think you're not conceited, it means you're very conceited indeed. So, let's wrap it up. You do need help, because you are proud. And you have to have the humility to admit it. But you also have to believe that God loves you and wants to help you. We need the humility to believe God when God says that he can help, that he wants to help. The tax collector went home justified that day, not just because he was willing to ask God for help and admit that he was a sinner, but because he believed God would help him as a sinner. Both of those things were true, and he went home justified. That's an incredible story. That could be your story, if you can believe that you are a sinner and that God wants to help you. Would you stand with me as we close? It's who God is. We know that about God. He is gracious and merciful and patient in love. God is love, and God's love never fails. So once again, we come to the antidote for sin. We've talked about a lot of different sinful struggles. Today is pride, and the antidote is always the same. It may take different shape or form, but it's always love. Love is the antidote to pride. To love God and to love your neighbors as you love yourself. All three have to be true. You have to love God, you have to love your neighbors, and you have to love yourself with a healthy, appropriated sort of love. And God can help you understand that. He writes to us through the hand of Paul, the apostle, that famous wedding chapter, 1 Corinthians 13. It tells us about agape love, self-sacrificial love. He says love is patient, love is kind. It doesn't envy, it doesn't boast. Anybody remember the next part? It's not proud. Love is not proud. The antidote to pride is love.